more concept I want to introduce everyone to, and that's the concept of a div, a division on a page known as a div. I'm in my HTML right now. At the bottom of the page, I'm going to say div. You see that automatically close. Again, div just stands for division. If I want to do anything with a div, really I need to give it an ID or a class. So I'll say div class equals, how about box? If I save my page and refresh, I won't see any difference. A div, again, is just a division on a page. It doesn't have any content, and it actually, unlike a lot of other HTML we've seen, it does not have any default styles attached to it. In fact, this div looks entirely invisible. I can't see it at all on the page. And that makes sense. What if we added some text inside of it? So I'm going to put a p tag inside here and say, I am a div. Save that and refresh. Well, there it is. I am a div. That's not very exciting. Why am I showing you this? Well, divs are really powerful. I'll show you. Let me switch over to our CSS, and I want to affect the div that we just made. I believe it's called dot box. That is, it is of the class box. So let's start by putting a border on it. 1 pixel solid black. I'm going to save that and refresh, and you can see something more now. A div is a block level element, right? Okay. So there's all kinds of stuff we can do with divs to basically just kind of treat them like shapes, like objects. In fact, I'll leave this text in here, but it's really not necessary. By creating an invisible placeholder on a page, I can use CSS to drastically adjust its appearance. So let's try that. Here's box, and I'm going to play around with it a little bit. Let's start with giving it a width. I'm going to say a width of 400 pixels. If I refresh, you'll see this thing shorten. Now let's say we wanted to get it into the middle of the page. Well, the shorthand version of doing that would be margin 0 auto. You might be wondering how that makes sense. Well, remember with margins we can do top, right, bottom, left, or treble. And that's the order in which we write them. If we wrote just margin 0, it would apply it on the top, right, bottom, and left. Well, if we wanted to combine top, bottom, and left, right, the way we would do that is the way this is written. Margin 0 auto, where 0 is the top and bottom margin, and auto is the left, right one. Let me get rid of this text that I wrote, and just leave margin 0 auto. If we refresh, you'll see that is in the center. Now, this text is not in the center, but we can get that to work. Text dash align center. So now the text is aligned inside our div, which is also centered. I like that border, but I think it would be better if it was thicker. So let's make it thicker. All right. I think it would also be better if it was a different color. Let's try green. All right. I think it would be even better if we could round it. Can we do that? Well, we can. It's border dash radius. I'll do 12 pixels. And you can see it curves. All right. What if we want to change the background color on the inside of that? Well, let's see. Background color yellow. That is a very bright yellow, isn't it? I'm going to make our border even thicker. I'm going to go to 14. Wow, that's crazy thick. Okay, maybe I overdid it. How about 9? This has width, but it doesn't have a height, right? Its height is determined by its content. That is, if we switched over here and got rid of the text, I am a div, and the p tag for that matter, saved and refreshed, you see this entire thing collapses to the point where we can't even see the yellow on the inside. Again, a div is a division on a page, but that's all it is. So if you don't add something to a div, or if you don't add a bunch of CSS rules to a div, you won't see it. I'm going to say height. Let's make it also 400 pixels, equal to the width. And now we have a square. Well, that's nice, But it would be really nice if we could round this out to the point where it was a circle. Everything in HTML is a rectangle, basically, which is kind of boring. But remember, we have a border radius of 12 pixels. We did that to curve these edges. Well, if we set the border radius to be equal to half the width and height of our div, it makes a circle. Pretty cool, huh? We could always plug our text back in here if we wanted. I'll change it slightly. I am a circle. Now it's centered, but it's not aligned vertically. That gets a little tricky, but that's okay. What we could do is try to push that text down. Well, how would we do that? We could say padding top 50 pixels. Well, is that going to work? Yes and no, huh? You see how it stretched out our circle? That's because our circle is trying to make room for this text. That's not really what we wanted, right? So that rule didn't work. But what about this? What if we said .box p, which is to say any p tag that happens inside the div called box? Well, what if that had padding top of 50 pixels? Well, there we go. Now it's still a circle and it's been pushed down. We're going to have to increase this number. Maybe 150? Yeah, it's getting there. I'll go for 190. Alright, good enough. And now we have some text in the middle of our circle. So you can see that we can combine rules within rules as long as it follows the structure of our HTML. P tags inside a div called box. That totally works. Well, that's the basic intro I wanted to give everyone. Sadly, our result is this incredibly unattractive page, but what are you going to do, right? If you are wondering where you can find additional CSS and HTML tags, well, they should be pretty easy to come across. If we did a Google search for HTML cheat sheet, there are lots of these on the web. Let's see. Well, geez, there's a whole bunch. I like this one from Smashing Magazine. At least I've heard of Smashing Magazine before. So let's see. Well, you can see what that looks like. Now, I don't think we really talked about more than one or two of these tags, so there's a lot of stuff to learn. The A tag is how you create a link, for example. It's pretty straightforward, though. Along the same lines, if we do a search for CSS Cheat Sheet. Oh, wow, from the same place, no less. Let's see what this one looks like. Yep, about what we'd expect. So we did background color, for example, and a few other things, but you can see there's a ton more rules. So remember, CSS and HTML are pre-written. If you have these sheets, they're way more extensive than you'll ever need them to be. In other words, there's way more rules in HTML and CSS than you will need to use on a regular basis. But nonetheless, you can read through a sheet like this and see what you want to use and what you want to do. For instance, you can see right here, border radius, something that we did, but you can also see that border top right radius is a rule as opposed to border bottom right radius. So you can write all these different rules for different particular parts. And that's kind of interesting, I think, in terms of the amount of power that you have. Now, one thing we're not covering is interactivity. That is, stuff to make it so our page does exciting interactive stuff, like when we hover over an image, it does something like move or shrink or grow or pop out or change the background or anything like that. Anything that's interactive really requires the use of JavaScript. And JavaScript is a scripting language, hence the name, as opposed to a markup language like HTML or CSS. So JavaScript is a little bit beyond our reading level, let's call it. But it is something you could get to once you are very comfortable with HTML and CSS. I would encourage you to play around with what we've created up to this point. Use these cheat sheets to manipulate the content that we've created up to this point. Don't worry about how ugly your page is, just worry about the fact that you made it. Going forward, really the next step would be to do something deliberate. That is to say, do something that you want to have happen on the page. For instance, do you think you could make a new blank page that has a circle like this on it that shows up right in the center of the page and has a different background color and a different border? Could you do the same thing with a tall rectangle? Or what about a long, thin one? That's what I mean by deliberate. Just come up with an idea and see if you can write the code to make it happen. Again, we've only covered the very basics of HTML and CSS, but hopefully what you've absorbed is that the syntax and structure is pretty straightforward, that the code itself, if you can call it that, is mostly written in English, and that hopefully you find it pretty easy to use. Similarly, with CSS, we use a different set of punctuation, a different syntax and structure, but it's very consistent and very readable, especially if English is your first language. So hopefully, at a minimum, I've removed some of the intimidating factor of code from your head, and the real way to get good at this stuff is to practice, practice, practice. So see if you can come up with some ideas and get them to work in HTML and CSS. Okay, so at this point, we have taken a look at the basics of HTML and CSS. Those are the two primary building blocks for a basic static web page. Now, obviously, there's a lot more to learn in order to become, say, a full-fledged web designer. But the logic is essentially the same from what we've covered up to this point. You might be wondering about interactive elements at this point, things like forms or pop-ups or really anything that responds to user input. Anything that's interactive is, generally speaking, going to be scripted in JavaScript. JavaScript, as we mentioned at the beginning of this course, is a scripting language as opposed to a pre-written or markup language. So it's obviously a little bit more complicated. It can become very complicated. So if you ever see some web designers banging their heads on the wall, it's probably JavaScript, although there are a lot of other possibilities. Some other things that we're not going to be able to cover in this brief course, but may be of interest to you if you want to expand on the topics we've covered, would be PHP, which is another scripting language. It can use databases written in SQL. So everything like a site like Amazon would use for functionality. That stuff's also pretty complicated. There's also a lot of information to know about a process called FTPing, which is how we upload and adjust our content on servers. And actually, servers themselves present a lot of interesting problems and issues that you have to learn to deal with. So obviously, we're only scratching the surface here, but the aim was to try to create one page that we've styled intentionally to look the way we want. And there's a lot more to learn beyond this if this is an interesting topic to you. So good luck in your future endeavors.